You stand in the fog of a London morning, the air heavy with coal smoke and uncertainty. Church bells toll from every direction, yet their song is dissonant, some calling to Rome, others to a new faith with no name yet. You can almost smell the ink on royal decrees drying, each one peeling centuries of obedience from the English soul. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe in this moment of history. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? It's astonishing. Voices from every continent joining to uncover a story 5 centuries old, bound by curiosity and the thrill of rediscovery. If you love history that feels alive, illuminated by both beauty and betrayal, hit that like button and join this growing circle of time travelers. Together, we'll step into the court where love became a weapon and a crown became a curse. The year is 1525. England stands on the edge of a spiritual earthquake, though few recognize the tremor beneath their feet. In candlelit chambers, whispers replace prayers. A woman's name drifts between courtiers' lips. Anne Boleyn. She is not yet a queen, not even a mistress, but something far more dangerous. An idea. When Anne returned from the French court, she brought with her a polish that seemed foreign and magnetic. She had learned the art of the glance, the subtle rebellion of wit sharpened like a blade. While English ladies bowed and smiled, Anne questioned and calculated. She wore French silks, but carried a Protestant mind, dangerous in a world still kneeling before the Pope. King Henry VIII noticed her first across the great hall during a masque, her dark eyes steady, refusing to lower before the sovereign. That single act was a spark in a room soaked in ambition. Henry, then married to Catherine of Aragon, saw in Anne not only beauty but resistance. It was intoxicating. She became the mirror he couldn't turn away from, clever, bold, and utterly unwilling to be possessed. When Henry began his courtship, his letters dripped with desperation and entitlement. "I beg to know your mind," he wrote, "for mine is wholly yours." Yet Anne's reply, delivered not in ink but in her conduct, was refusal. She would not be his mistress. She would be his wife, or nothing. In a time when women were expected to submit, her defiance was unthinkable. But Henry's infatuation was stronger than his piety. He began to imagine a world where no pope could deny him what he wanted. Cardinals tried to dissuade him, advisers whispered caution, but Henry's obsession grew into doctrine. The so-called king's great matter, the quest to annul his marriage to Catherine, wasn't merely lust disguised as righteousness. It became the political and spiritual earthquake of the century. As Anne rose, England's faith cracked. Monasteries whispered rebellion. Priests found themselves divided between loyalty to Rome and obedience to the crown. In taverns, men debated scripture as if it were gossip. And through it all, Anne smiled with the composure of a chess master who already knew the board's endgame. But even power has a sound, a low, relentless hum of envy and fear. The court was an audience waiting for her to fall. Some saw her as Eve, tempting the king into ruin. Others saw her as Jezebel, a foreign witch bewitching God's anointed. Yet Anne was neither. She was the first English queen who believed that intelligence was not a sin. In 1533, her moment arrived. A secret marriage, a swelling belly, and a coronation the likes of which England had never seen. The procession stretched from the Tower to Westminster, gold cloth rippling in the June light, trumpets sounding her triumph. Henry's banners proclaimed a new era, but in the crowds below, many whispered prayers for Queen Catherine. They watched Anne pass and muttered, "She wears the crown, but not God's favor." That summer, she gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth. The king smiled for the court but raged behind closed doors. He had promised himself and his new church that God approved his union, that this woman was destined to bear him a son. Yet fate had written another story. Anne knew then that her power rested on the edge of a blade sharper than any sword. She poured her energy into reform, surrounding herself with scholars, translating the Gospels into English, arguing that faith should belong to every soul, not just priests. She believed the word of God was not to be guarded, but given. And in doing so, she became more revolutionary than she ever intended. Henry began to turn. The same mind that once thrilled him now irritated his authority. Each sermon Anne recommended, each reformer she protected, deepened his unease. Even her laughter became an act of defiance. One night, as chroniclers would later recall, Henry gazed at her across the great table and said, "You have made me break with Rome, but do not think you can make me break with myself." Anne did not flinch. "Then perhaps, Your Majesty," she replied softly, "you have only changed masters." Silence fell. Servants froze. The candles guttered in the draught as if the air itself recoiled from the moment. It was the kind of silence that only ends one way, with a reckoning. By dawn, the bells of England rang again, some for the new faith, others for the old, but all tolled for Anne, the queen who dared to rewrite God. She stood at the pinnacle of her power, but her enemies were already counting the days. For in the Tudor world, no light burned brighter than ambition, and none burned out faster. The Tower gates close with a metallic groan that echoes across the Thames. London goes still. Even the ravens seem to pause, as if sensing that something unnatural has begun. The King's court, once a glittering maze of music and perfume, has turned into a machine of whispers. Servants vanish overnight. Courtiers walk in pairs, afraid to speak aloud. And in a cold stone chamber at the Tower of London, a queen sits alone, staring at her trembling hands as the world she built begins to unmake itself. It is May 1536. The air smells of rain and betrayal. 5 men have already been seized: Henry Norris, Francis Weston, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, and George Boleyn, the Queen's own brother. They are accused of adultery with the same woman who wears the crown. The charges are not only obscene, they are impossible. But in the kingdom of Henry VIII, impossibility is no defense. When power decides upon guilt, truth becomes an inconvenience. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, moves through the shadows like a priest preparing a sacrifice. He knows what Henry wants: freedom from a wife who no longer serves his ambitions, and perhaps from the memory of his own sins. Anne's sharp tongue had mocked his reforms, challenged his decisions, and, most dangerously, made him look small before the king. Now Cromwell's revenge is dressed as righteousness. Witnesses are questioned, then threatened, then broken. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, is the first to confess, after hours of interrogation that no one witnesses but everyone imagines. When asked why he lied, he supposedly whispered, "Because I was asked to." His confession becomes the cornerstone of Anne's doom. Cromwell smiles faintly. He does not need truth. He needs coherence, the illusion of guilt so precise it cannot be doubted. In the Tower, Anne's thoughts drift between prayer and disbelief. She writes feverishly, her quill scratching across parchment like a heartbeat. To Henry, she pleads her innocence. Never prince had wife more loyal in heart, in thought, in affection than Anne Boleyn. But her words will never reach him. The letters vanish into Cromwell's files, sealed and unseen. Outside, London watches the drama unfold like a play written by unseen hands. Ballads circulate through taverns. Street preachers thunder that the Queen has bewitched the king. Even the river seems to carry rumor, carrying whispers from the palace to the docks. In the minds of the people, Anne is already condemned, by her intelligence, her ambition, her refusal to be silent. On May 15th, she is led to the great hall within the Tower. It is the first trial in English history to judge a queen for treason. The space smells of candle wax and damp stone. Nobles take their seats. Men who once bowed before her now summoned to weigh her worth. Among them sits Henry Percy, her first love, his face pale, his hands trembling. The irony is unbearable. The man who once vowed to marry her must now condemn her to die. Anne enters in a gown of dark gray damask, embroidered with silver thread. Her hair is coiled beneath a simple headdress, her eyes calm, almost luminous. When asked how she pleads, she rises and says clearly, "Not guilty. I was ever a faithful wife to the king." Her voice does not break. For a moment, even her enemies hesitate. Cromwell sits beside the prosecution, eyes fixed on her. Each charge reads like a grotesque parody of her life. Dates that coincide with her pregnancies, trysts that would have been physically impossible. The evidence collapses under its own absurdity, but the theater must continue. Every pause, every gasp, every silence becomes part of the performance. Justice in this court is choreography. When her brother George is brought in, he too denies all charges. He is accused of the unspeakable, incest with the Queen. "If it be true," he says bitterly, "then none is safe from hell." His words echo in the chamber like a curse. Moments later, the verdict is declared: guilty of adultery, of treason, of betraying the sacred body of the king. The peers rise one by one, speaking the word guilty as though pronouncing a prayer. Henry Percy can barely stand. Cromwell's quill scratches the record. The Queen bows her head, not in shame, but in something that looks almost like pity. She thanks the judges for their fairness and prays God to forgive them. When she is led back to her cell, she murmurs to her ladies, "They have not been able to prove me guilty of the least sin, but I must make ready for death." Her composure terrifies them. To die without flinching is the only defiance left. That night, the tower is silent except for the distant murmur of the river. Cromwell meets with messengers from the king, confirming that the executioner from Calais has been summoned. A French sword, not an English axe. Officially, it is mercy. Unofficially, it is theater perfected, swift, precise, impossible to interrupt. Anne kneels before the crucifix and whispers a final prayer, not for deliverance, but for clarity. "If I am to die," she says quietly, "may God open the eyes of the king." Outside her window, the moon breaks through the clouds, silvering the courtyard where the scaffold is being built plank by plank. The hammer blows echo through the tower like distant thunder. Each strike announces what England already knows. The Queen's body will fall, but her shadow is only beginning to rise. Dawn crept cold and gray over the Tower of London. The courtyard was slick with dew, the air thick with the silence of hundreds holding their breath. Anne Boleyn stood at the center of it all, small, composed, draped in a cloak of steel-gray damask. Around her, the crowd shifted uneasily, the murmur of cloth and breath louder than their voices. The French swordsman waited, his blade hidden beneath a layer of straw to catch the light softly, not cruelly. Before him knelt a queen who once commanded nations, and now waited to lose everything that made her human. The executioner bowed low. "Madame," he said in accented English, "forgive me, for it is my duty." Anne nodded, her voice calm, almost tender. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said. "I pray you dispatch me quickly." Then she turned toward the watching crowd, and the morning wind caught her veil. "Good Christian people," she said, "I am come hither to die, according to the law, and by the law I am judged to die." Her words trembled not with fear, but with conviction. "I die the king's faithful servant, and God's first." The moment hung suspended. Then, as she knelt and prayed, the swordsman gave a soft command. "Boy, bring me my sword." She turned her head instinctively toward the call, precisely as the blade swept through the air. One flash, one whisper of steel, and silence. But witnesses swore it did not end there. Several among the crowd claimed her lips continued to move for several heartbeats, murmuring prayers, perhaps, or curses. One courtier fainted when he saw her eyes open and close. The chroniclers would later debate whether it was reflex or revelation, but in that courtyard it felt as though her spirit refused to leave. The head fell not with a thud, but a strange, soft sound, like silk slipping from marble. Her ladies stepped forward, weeping. They gathered her remains into a linen cloth. No coffin was prepared, no monument waited. The king had given no instructions, save one, that there be no public display of her head. This alone was extraordinary. The heads of traitors were customarily mounted on pikes over London Bridge as warnings to all, but Anne's vanished. Some said her attendants buried it beneath the altar of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds. Others whispered that a sympathetic guard carried it away, hiding it beneath his cloak, fearful that the king might desecrate it. There were even murmurs that Anne's family smuggled it from the Tower entirely, buried it on Boleyn soil, where the king's reach ended. But no record survives. Not a single written line tells where the queen's face was laid to rest. In the years that followed, the absence grew into legend. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne 2 decades later, she never spoke her mother's name in public. Yet she wore a small gold locket, one she never let out of sight. Inside, some said, was a painted miniature of Anne's face. Others claimed it held a lock of dark hair. Whether truth or superstition, it became the first relic in a mystery that would stretch across centuries. By the 19th century, the Tower Chapel had fallen into disrepair. Queen Victoria ordered renovations, and in the process, workmen uncovered several skeletons beneath the floor, women of slight frame, buried hastily in wooden chests. One, in particular, drew attention: the bones of a woman in her mid-30s, small and elegant with a delicate neck. The remains were reinterred under a marble slab inscribed Anne Boleyn, Queen of Henry VIII, but no one could prove it was her. The skull was never matched, no relic ever confirmed. Even in death, her identity was uncertain. Historians debated endlessly. Could her head truly have been buried elsewhere? Could her enemies have destroyed it to erase her entirely? Or did her daughter, now a queen, quietly reunite the severed parts long after the crime was forgotten? Then there were the other tales, the ones that belonged more to ghost stories than archives. Tower guards swore that on moonless nights they saw a woman in gray glide along the chapel path, her head cradled in her arms. She was said to walk the green where she had died, the hem of her gown whispering across the grass. Others spoke of footsteps echoing down the Queen's House corridor, of candles snuffing out when her name was spoken. A haunting, they said, not of vengeance, but of memory. Yet behind the superstition lies something deeper, almost tragic. Anne's missing head is more than a relic, it is the perfect symbol of erasure. Henry had severed not only her body but her legacy, attempting to slice her name from the fabric of history. And yet she endures, through portraits that may or may not be hers, through a daughter who became the greatest monarch England ever knew, through a mystery that refuses to rest. Centuries later, even the stone of the tower seems to remember. During restoration, masons reported strange markings near her supposed grave, carvings of initials, faint and deliberate. A.B. No record explains them. Perhaps they were left by a grieving servant, perhaps by someone who knew where her head truly lies. When the final prayers were said that May morning in 1536, the crowd dispersed. The executioner left with his gold, and the king remarried within days. But something stayed behind, an echo that history could never silence. And somewhere beneath the chapel floor, or in the secret soil of her birthright, the truth still waits. Not as a ghost, but as a question. What does it mean for a story to survive when its body is gone? The answer may lie not in the tower, but in the fact that we are still telling her tale. For Anne Boleyn's head may have vanished, but her voice never did.